There are many bizarre and intriguing criminal cases, but for me, this is definitely one of the lowest levels humanity can reach. Some of these cases are so poorly publicized that I had to do a massive amount of research just to bring this video to you. I'm Leonardo Braga, you are watching the Viroscopo channel, and this is the iceberg of Brazilian cannibals. And if you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member. With a very small contribution, you help keep the channel going and also get access to exclusive content. Now, let's get to the video. This topic is a bit complicated, so we're going to approach it in different ways involving cannibalism, those that have been confirmed either by evidence or confession, and cases that involve suspicion, investigation, and rumors. And to start off, the Garanhuns cannibals. Imagine you buy a snack on the street, a coccinha, maybe an empada, from a friendly vendor. You eat it, and without knowing, you've just been forced to take part in a cannibalistic ritual. This bizarre scene, which seems like it came straight out of a twisted horror movie script, was the grim reality experienced by the residents of Garanhuns in Pernambuco. The discovery didn't come from a complex intelligence operation, but from a mistake made by the criminals. It all started when the family of Gisele Helena de Silva, one of the victims, received a credit card bill at home in her name. The strange thing was that the bill showed purchases made days after her disappearance, and this trail was exactly what the police needed. By tracking the purchases, investigators obtained security camera footage from the stores, and in the recordings, a seemingly ordinary couple was using Gisele's card with an eerily calm demeanor. The identification was quick and led the police to a house on Emboaba Street on April 9th, 2012. There, the officers found a macabre trio: Jorge Beltrao Negromonte, the patriarch and mastermind, Isabel Cristina, his wife and enabler, and Bruna Cristina, the young lover and executioner. They were the only members of a sect they called the cartel, whose stated mission was to purify the world by killing 3 impure women per year. But the definitive proof of the horror was still to come. Inside the house, along with the trio, there was a small child, frightened by the presence of the police. The girl, in an innocent gesture, pointed to the backyard. The excavations began, and they discovered the dismembered bodies of Gisele and another woman, Alexandra de Silva Falcao. Both were buried in shallow graves. Taken to the police station, their facade of normality quickly crumbled. Isabel confessed to everything. She coldly described her method. With her gentle talk about the Word of God, she lured the victims to her house, also offering job opportunities that paid well for the time. And once inside, Jorge would attack them from behind with a single, fatal knife blow to the throat. The body was then taken to the bathroom, where he and Bruna would dismember it. Isabel confirmed that parts of the flesh, like thighs and liver, were kept in the freezer for their own consumption during their purification rituals. And then she spoke the most profane act of all, a phrase that sealed the infamy of the case. We cooked the meat properly, made coccinha, and ate it, and by selling the snacks, society, without knowing it, ended up consuming the meat that they produced. The investigation soon discovered that the bloodbath had started much earlier. The first known victim was Jessica Camila, a 17-year-old teenager murdered in 2008 in the city of Olinda, and this is where the story reaches its deepest level of cruelty. Jessica was the mother of a little girl who was only 1 year old. The trio's real plan was to adopt the child after getting rid of the mother, and after the crime, that's exactly what they did. Jessica's daughter spent the next 4 years being raised by her mother's killers. Living in the house where other women would be murdered, she was, according to the criminals themselves, fed with the flesh of the victims, and this girl was a forced participant in the rituals, a silent witness whose trauma is unimaginable. Years later, she said something about Jorge. He's a cannibal. He cut off her head and raped her. The mastermind behind all this depravity was Jorge Beltrao. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he had a history of violence since his teenage years. In the same year as the Gernhunds crimes, he published a book called Revelations of a Schizophrenic, an attempt to create a narrative of insanity in which he described himself as a man tormented by evil forces. However, the methodical way they planned the crimes, robbed the victims, and hid the bodies told a different story, and the justice system, based on psychiatric reports, agreed, despite his illness. He and his accomplices were fully capable of understanding the criminal nature of their actions. It wasn't madness, it was evil. And the trio faced 2 trials. In 2014 for the case of Jessica, and in 2018 for the crimes in Gernhunds. The defense strategies tried to blame Jorge, painting the women as victims of his manipulation, but the evidence and the coldness of their testimonies, like Bruna's, who said that Saul was nothing compared to the scene she witnessed, convinced the jury. The final sentences were as follows. Jorge was sentenced to more than 98 years in prison, Bruna to more than 94 years, and Isabel to more than 91 years. And you know what's even crazier? Jorge Beltrao found a new identity behind bars, that of an evangelical pastor. In videos circulating online, he preaches to other inmates, but the sincerity of his conversion is shattered by a confession he made to his lawyer. He refuses to request any reduction of his sentence because he is fully aware of his own nature. His final statement on the matter is the most honest and terrifying of all. If I get out, I'll kill again. Crimes of Alvarado Street. Would you trust your butcher? And what if the sausage he sold around the neighborhood wasn't made of pork, but of people? In 19th century Brazil, in Porto Alegre, a former police officer, his lover, and a butcher joined forces to commit a series of brutal crimes. Let's dive into the infamous case 5616 to separate fact from myth in the Alvarado Street crimes and investigate the macabre story of the supposed human sausage factory that terrorized the capital of Rio Grande do Sul. Our story doesn't begin with crime, but with the journey of its main characters. On one side, we have Jose Ramos, the son of a deserter from the Ragamuffin War, whose first act of violence was stabbing his own father to death to defend his mother. He moves to Porto Alegre and, ironically, becomes a police inspector, but his career ends when he is expelled for trying to decapitate a criminal who had already surrendered. And from then on, he starts living in the gray area of the law as an informant for Police Chief Dario Calado, a crucial detail that may have given him a dangerous sense of impunity. On the other side, we have Katerina Paz. Her story is a tragedy from the very beginning. Born in Hungary, she survived the 1848 revolution, but not before being assaulted by soldiers and witnessing her entire family being murdered. She flees, marries just to escape, and sees her husband commit suicide during the journey to Brazil. She arrives in Porto Alegre in 1857, a 20-year-old woman, alone, uprooted, carrying deep trauma, and fate brings these two figures together in 1863. Jose Ramos, despite his violent past, moved in high society, and at a theater play he meets Katerina. They start a relationship and move into a house on Alvarado Street. The house belonged to a German immigrant named Carlos Klausner, who owned a successful butcher shop nearby. Carlos Klausner, a lonely man, soon became friends with and a protege of Jose Ramos, who also spoke German. And thus, the trio that would terrorize the city was formed. The trio's modus operandi was cruel and calculated. Katerina's beauty and her fluency in German were the perfect bait. She lured the victims, almost always newly arrived German immigrants with some money, to the house on Alvarado Street. Once inside, the trap was sprung. Jose Ramos would ambush the target, murdering them brutally. The motive, according to the case files, was robbery followed by murder. They killed for money and valuables, but the story takes an even darker turn with the involvement of Carlos Klausner. According to the confession allegedly made by Katerina, it was the butcher himself who suggested the solution to the problem of the bodies, turning them into sausages. And for months, this worked, but everything started to fall apart in April 1864 with the disappearance of two men, the Portuguese merchant Januario Martins and the traveling salesman Jose Ignacio de Souza Avila. Both were last seen entering Jose Ramos's house, and when summoned to testify by Chief of Police Calado, Jose Ramos gave a flimsy excuse, saying the men had traveled. And that story didn't really convince anyone. The police went to Alvarado Street, and what they found was a true scene of horror. In the basement, they discovered the decomposing remains of a body, which would later be identified as that of the accomplice who became a victim, Carlos Klausner. Apparently, out of fear, the butcher was planning to flee, and Jose Ramos, seeing him as a weak link, eliminated him. And the search continued in the backyard. Inside a well, the police found the bodies of Januario and Jose Ignacio, along with the carcass of the traveling salesman's dog, who, according to reports, had been barking at the door for days after his owner disappeared. Jose Ramos was arrested immediately, and Katerina, at the time, was already in prison for other crimes. The trial was swift and presided over by a controversial figure, the police chief himself, Dario Calado, who also held the position of judge. And this bizarre concentration of power, where the investigator is also the judge, casts a shadow over the proceedings, especially considering that Jose Ramos was his trusted informant. The death sentence for Jose Ramos may have been Calado's way of getting rid of a problem that could have tarnished his reputation. The most compelling evidence, besides the bodies, was the confession attributed to Katerina Paz. She was the one who detailed the crimes and, crucially, introduced the story of the human meat sausages. Based on this, Jose Ramos was sentenced to hang and Katerina received 13 years in prison as an accomplice. And Jose Ramos's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by Emperor Dom Pedro II. And he died in 1893, denying his crimes until the end. Katerina served her sentence and disappeared from historical records after being released in 1891. And of course, it's important to point out that in the case files there is no material evidence that sausages made with human meat were ever sold or consumed. That was a confession made by Katerina herself. The Cannibal of Goiás, Corumbá. For 6 years, a serial killer traveled through 4 Brazilian states, killing, dismembering, and committing acts of cannibalism. And the worst part, he was invisible to the police, who only discovered his existence when a crime involving foreign victims became an international case. This is the story of Jose Vicente Matias, known as the Cannibal of Goyas. Before we can understand the case, we need to understand who he was. Born in Ferminopolis, Goyas, Jose Vicente was a former artisan who lived as a nomad, which made it difficult for the police to track his movements. And even though he was illiterate, investigators described him as an extremely clever guy with an impressive ability to manipulate people. He used a simple hippie facade to get close to his victims, who were usually women traveling alone or in small groups. They believed in his good intentions, and that was the perfect bait, but his criminal path didn't start out of nowhere. In 1998, he was arrested for rape and violent assault in Rio Quinte, Goiás. It turns out he managed to escape from jail that same year. This failure of the system was the trigger, the spark that set a convicted sexual criminal free to become a serial killer. He escalated the violence brutally, and his crimes became a nightmare that spread across the country. The first confirmed victim was Natalia Canjos Carneiro, who was only 15 years old. She was killed in September 1999 in Tres Marias, Minas Gerais. Natalia's death, less than a year after his escape from prison, set a pattern that he would repeat for years. In June 2000, he struck again. Simone Lima Pinho, a 26-year-old artisan, traveled to Chapada Diamantina in Bahia and disappeared. Her mother, Rosanilda, began a search that became a national cause. Simone's body was only found in 2005 after Jose Vicente's arrest. He confessed and led the police to the shallow grave where he had buried her 5 years earlier. Identification was only possible thanks to a dental appliance she wore. And in January 2004, the terror reached Goiânia. Jose Vicente kidnapped the student Lydian Vieira de Mello, who was 16 years old. He kept her captive for a day and a half, and during that time, he committed acts of vampirism, drinking the girl's blood while she was still alive. After killing her with a blow to the head, he dismembered the body, decapitated her, and threw the remains into a stream. After Lydian, he struck again in April 2004 in Pirenópolis, Goiás. His victim was Catherine Rakitov, a 29-year-old Russian-Israeli tourist who was in Brazil for a friend's wedding. She kept in constant contact with her family, and when she stopped calling, it set off an alarm. Catherine was seen talking to Jose Vicente, who presented himself as a harmless artisan. The disappearance of a foreigner mobilized the Israeli embassy and private investigator Robson Feitosa. And it was his persistence that, in the end, put all the pieces together. The next victim was the German tourist Marianne Kern, 49 years old, murdered in 2004 in Barreiras, Maranhão. Her body was found in a shallow grave, and in his confession, Jose Vicente said he killed her with a club after she mocked his sexual impotence. The last known crime was against Nuria Fernandez Colada, a 27-year-old Spanish tourist, killed in March 2005 in Alcântara, Maranhão. He killed her with a club and, according to his confession, performed a macabre ritual, dancing around a bonfire and then drinking her blood and eating parts of her brain. The motive he claimed was the same as in the crime against Marianne. The victim had mocked his sexual dysfunction. The arrest of Jose Vicente in March 2015 in Bragança, Para, only happened after the bodies of Nuria and Marianne were found. Private investigator Robson Feitosa, who was looking for him because of Catherine's disappearance, traveled to the interrogation. There, He noticed that Jose Vicente was carrying a bag identical to Catherine's. Confronted with the evidence, the killer broke down. He confessed not only to the deaths of the 3 tourists, but also linked himself to 3 other murders in Guayas, Bahia, and Minas Gerais. And after 6 years, all the crimes were finally connected to a single perpetrator. He was convicted in different jurisdictions, with sentences totaling more than 90 years in prison. And in 2016, he was sentenced to 25 years for Catherine's death. In 2018, he received 22 years and 4 months for Neria's death. But even with the combined sentences adding up to more than 90 years, Brazilian law sets a maximum limit of 40 years in prison. Currently, Jose Vicente Matias, the cannibal of Goiás, remains imprisoned at the Odnir Guimarães Penitentiary in Aparecida de Goiânia, in Goiás. Cannibalism in Perube. In a city on the coast of Sao Paulo, a bizarre crime took place. A homeless woman got into an argument with a man and, because of that, killed him and committed a brutal act of cannibalism. And even worse, she spread the story that she had made a soup with the victim's organs to serve to other homeless people. This crime happened in March 2025 in the city of Perube, on the coast of Sao Paulo. The police were called to respond to a report of a body found on the street, and what the officers saw was shocking. The body was that of Celso Marques Ferreira, a 60-year-old man who was homeless. The body showed signs of extreme violence and mutilation. The civil police investigation was quick, and just a few hours later they already had their main suspect, Josefa Lima de Souza, a 65-year-old woman who was also living on the streets. It turns out that Celso and Josefa already had a history of fights and disagreements. The police then went to Josefa, who was known by the nickname Gringa, and took her to the police station. And what happened there was surprising. Spontaneously, she confessed that she had killed Celso with an improvised knife. In her statement, Josefa not only confessed to the murder, but also to the brutality of the acts that followed. She said that she removed Celso's heart and penis, roasted the organs over a fire, and ate them. Besides her, the police also arrested Josefa's partner, a man named Robson, 41 years old, who lived with her on the streets on suspicion of involvement in the crime. But Josefa insisted that she acted alone, and the police investigation deepened. Witnesses said that Josefa had prepared a soup with the victim's organs and distributed it to other homeless people in the area. The police found a fire pit and an empty pot that, in theory, could have been used in the crime. This part of the story, the soup, caused a huge stir in the media, making the case even more bizarre and frightening. What is known is that Josefa left a crucial clue at the crime scene. She left a sign with the phrase "rapist catches Gringa," which linked the crime to her. On one hand, she wanted to justify the crime by saying the victim was an abuser. On the other hand, she gave the police her own nickname, which led to her arrest. The profiles of the victim, Celso, and the accused, Josefa, are limited due to a lack of information. Both of them were homeless, which makes them practically invisible to society and to official records. And there isn't much information about Celso's life. Josefa, on the other hand, admitted to the police that she used drugs and alcohol, factors that may be important for understanding her mental state at the time of the crime. In her statement, she said that she killed the victim with the power of her mind, which suggests that she might have been experiencing a psychotic episode or some kind of detachment from reality. This contradiction between an act that tries to have a logical justification and a statement that contains delusional elements will undoubtedly be the central point in the court case. And the police are working with the hypothesis that Josefa did not act alone. This line of investigation is supported by witnesses who point to the involvement of her partner Robson and a third man known as Nigeo. Investigators believe that Josefa's physical condition alone would be insufficient to overpower and mutilate Celso. But for now, the involvement of Robson and this Nigeo, who has not yet been located, has not been confirmed. And the legal proceedings, for now, are still in the police investigation phase, and there is no public information about what will happen next. The Arapiraca Cannibal. In a city in Alagoas, a fight turned into a brutal crime. A man killed his ex-partner, committed an act of cannibalism, and to prove his monstrosity, ate her heart with cachaca. To understand what happened, we need to go back a bit in time before the crime. The main character in this story, Jose Jorge de Silva, was not a first-time offender. Investigations revealed that he had already served an 8-month sentence for a previous homicide, and at the time the crime happened, he was a fugitive from justice. He wasn't just a regular guy who snapped in a moment of madness. In fact, he had already taken a life and was living outside the law. What happened to Edilza, the victim, was just a continuation of a pattern of violence he already had in his life. Now, let's get to the facts. The crime happened on September 21st, 2010. The scene was an abandoned warehouse on the AL 220 highway in Arapiraca. The place was isolated, perfect for violence to happen far from anyone's eyes. Jose Jorge and his ex-partner, Edilza Vicente de Silva, were there drinking together. And that's when the argument started. The investigation found that the fight was because of Edilza's new relationship. The turning point, the trigger for the crime, was when she made a provocation. Edilza said that her new boyfriend was better in bed than Jose Jorge. That comment, which might seem trivial, was the spark that set off an explosion of hatred and violence. In his confession, Jose Jorge gave a different version of the crime, claiming he had been betrayed. He said that Edilza had kissed another man right in front of him. He said he went home and came back 2 days later, when he found her alone and invited her to have a drink. And regardless of which version of events is true, Jose Jorge's response was brutal. He grabbed a serrated knife and attacked Edilza. But the violence didn't stop there. The murder was just the beginning of a series of acts that became the most bizarre part of the story. With Edilza still alive, begging for help, Jose Jorge kept going. He opened up her belly and took out her organs. He kept removing them until he found her heart. After the murder, Jose Jorge didn't run away in a panic. He took Edilza's heart, put it in a plastic bag, and went to the city of Palmera dos Indios. When he got there, he asked a friend to roast the victim's heart. He grabbed a bottle of pita cachaca and, alone, consumed the organ. After committing the crime, Jose Jorge managed to stay on the run for almost 3 years, but his freedom came to an end in an unexpected way. In October 2013, he and 2 other men held a taxi driver at gunpoint in the state of Sergipe. They tied up the driver in the trunk, and the underage boy who was driving lost control of the vehicle, which went off a cliff. The three were caught in the act and arrested. At the time of his arrest, Jose Jorge gave the police a false name. But a week later, investigators discovered his real identity and that he was wanted by the authorities for committing the crime in Alagoas. In court, his defense tried to argue that he acted under a